Welcome, everybody. I'm happy to see that so many folks have taken time out of their day for the University Interdisciplinary Colloquium today. I'm really excited to have you with us for the next hour. My name is Michael O'Rourke. I am the director of the Center for Interdisciplinarity here at Michigan State, and this is the University Interdisciplinary Colloquium. We begin these sessions with the Michigan State University land acknowledgement. Michigan State University occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. In particular, the university resides on lands ceded in the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw. We recognize Michigan's 12 federally recognized Native nations, historic Indigenous communities in Michigan, Indigenous individuals and communities who live here now, and those who were forcibly removed from their homelands. In offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty, history, and experiences. If you're interested in learning more about the MSU land acknowledgement, I'll put a couple of links in the chat here when I'm finished with the introduction. As I said, this is the University Interdisciplinary Colloquium, which is a series that is organized by the Center for Interdisciplinarity at Michigan State and sponsored by the College of Arts and Letters. We are a series that makes space for people on campus at MSU who are doing interdisciplinary work that centers the humanities or the arts. The universities like Michigan State are typically inclined to lean into interdisciplinarity as a research modality. And often that's because it is associated with large awards from federal agencies. As a consequence, interdisciplinarity, at least in the minds of many on campuses like this, is associated with the sciences or with STEM more broadly. And I think what gets lost in all of this is how much innovative and really groundbreaking interdisciplinary work is pursued by humanists and artists. And so this series really exists to amplify the important interdisciplinary work of humanists and artists, and to give them an opportunity to talk about their projects. Our series runs every other week in the fall and the spring. This is the last UIC session of 2020-2021. The next one will be in September on the 17th, which is a Friday, from 12 to 1. And our speaker will be Dr. April Baker-Bell, who is a faculty member in English and African American and African Studies at Michigan State. So we hope maybe you can put a pin in that, and we'd love to see you back here in a few months. Today, we're going to have a presentation by our honored and guest here, Dr. David Godden, after which we'll have a Q&A. If you would, please deposit your questions in the chat, and I will then go ahead and read through them in the order they're deposited. So don't hesitate to lay down a question if you have one as the presentation is ongoing. And then when the top of the hour comes, we'll call it a colloquium. And I am really thrilled to have an opportunity to introduce my colleague in the Department of Philosophy, Dr. David Godden. Dr. Godden teaches philosophy here at Michigan State University, and his research interests include disagreement, viewed as a social and epistemic phenomenon, and our practices of transacting reasons in the management and resolution of those disagreements with each other. Today, he is with us to deliver a talk entitled, "Is Persistent Disagreement a Reason to Distrust?" Dr. Godden.
Thank you very much, Michael, Professor O'Rourke. Let me please just take a moment. I'll be sharing my screen with you momentarily. Before that, just to offer my thanks to Professor O'Rourke, to Dr. Stephanie Vasco, to the Center for Interdisciplinarity for inviting me and supporting this talk, making it possible, as well for the College of Arts and Letters for their support of this talk and this series. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to take some time today and to share with you a little bit about some of the things that I've been thinking about lately. And also then I want to thank you for taking some time out of what I know is a busy day in an inordinately busy and stressful time to come and hear about some of the things that I've been thinking about and working on. I really am deeply appreciative, and I really hope that I can, we have good time for your comments, because I'm sure that I would benefit from your thoughts. This is still a project I've been thinking about for a little while, but I'm certainly still working on it, and I would really value your thoughts. So I hope to leave good time to do that. I am wrestling a little bit with a cat who's just off camera, who doesn't appreciate what is going on and would like to sort of sit in my lap. So if sometimes I seem a little bit distracted, please understand why. As well, I just want to say that my understanding is that this talk is meant as a kind of an academic paper, but a public kind of talk, that is. So I'm kind of trying to speak to a couple of different audiences, my sort of academic colleagues and peers, as well as a general public audience. And I hope to have gotten the balance right in this talk. I'm sure that I won't have in certain kinds of places. And so hopefully those kinds of things can come out in the discussion. One last thing before I start, and as I do this, I'll sort of just share the screen with you, is my work. I'm a philosopher, but my work is interdisciplinary in the following way. One of the things that I study is argumentation, and relatedly, I study disagreement and trust. This paper is about all of those things. And those subject areas are robustly studied by people across a variety of different fields. Trust in particular, anyone who's looked into the literature on that knows that it's not merely philosophers who are writing about trust, but sociologists are doing it, people who are working in management theory, for example, in human relations. People all across the disciplinary spectrum are looking at trust as a phenomena and sort of how we sort of manage it, how we gain it, how we lose it, what it is. Similarly with argument, when we study argumentation, the people whose work that I am reading cut across disciplinary bounds. They're people from communication theory, they're sociologists, they're English rhetoricians, people who study debate and forensics, philosophers, computer scientists, people in legal theory. So the issues, I think, as well as how they are studied, are issues that reach across a vast set of disciplinary bounds, and they benefit from the results of work in each of those disciplines and those disciplines together. I approach this mainly as a philosopher, as will come apparent in my talk. So that didn't do what I wanted it to. Okay. So let me give you a quick talk outline. I'm going to talk first a little bit about disagreement, and then I'll talk to you a little bit about trust and distrust. Then I want to say a few words about arguing, particularly arguing as it might seem to be an act of trust. And insofar as that picture resonates with you, then the next point on the outline will be also a little bit resonant, I think. That is, sometimes we can see the failure of reasoning together as evidence of distrust. And I want to sort of look at how that can actually seem plausible to us. And finally, I want to offer my own argument, my own thesis into the paper. And that is that persuasion failure is in fact not a reason to distrust. So the first part of the paper is sort of setting out the framework. The next part is to try to make a position that I worry is kind of prevalent. I try to make that position plausible. I try to see and understand how somebody could see things that way. And then, having done that, I try in the last section to show why perhaps we ought not to. And I want to just mention, it'll come up in the talk, kind of why I take this to be important. Our public discourse is characterized by disagreement, by dissent, by polarization, and ultimately by distrust. And when one considers this, the sort of the nature of distrust as an attitude, it makes resolution, it makes agreement, it makes building trust difficult. It itself is an impediment to our getting along with each other in ways that we can resolve our differences. And when that distrust is warranted, of course, is justified, then we should not set it aside or ignore it. My concern, and the thing that I'm trying to address in this talk, is one place that I see people as perhaps being prone to come to distrust when perhaps it isn't warranted. And in that sense, my hope in looking at this work is to help us to better resolve our differences by getting one impediment out of the way. So there are a bunch of slides. I'm going to go through them pretty quickly. Some of them will have quotes on them that I won't read through, but in the interest of time, I'll put them up there and talk over them rather than always read them. One of the things that we should notice about disagreements is that it doesn't just reflect some tension or incompatibility in our viewpoints, but rather it actually affects the dynamics of our relationships with each other. That is, it creates a tension between us because minimally it makes us adversarial in a certain kind of a way, and we don't grant each other the recognition that we feel that we deserve. So let me talk briefly about each of those. The philosopher Trudy Govier argues that disagreement makes us minimally adversarial, or puts us into a minimally adversarial relationship, that when we hold a view and when we take ourselves to be correct in holding our view, the views that we do, this leads to a kind of a minimal adversariality. And here's how. From the fact that we take ourselves to be correct in holding the views that we do, it follows that views logically incompatible with those we take to be incorrect. And from this, it follows that we're committed then to viewing those who disagree with us, those who hold those views logically incompatible with our own, to be mistaken in their views. So that puts us in a relationship where I think I'm right and I think you're wrong, just because we disagree. So it's not just a difference in our opinions or a tension between the things that we believe. It's a tension between us. And in many respects, that tension is also something that needs to be resolved, as well as the sort of the cognitive tension of the differences in the viewpoints that we hold. Similarly, there's a normative dimension to this tension between us. When I hold a view, I claim two normative statuses. I claim that I'm correct in the view that I hold, that I'm right in holding it, and I claim that I'm entitled to the view that I hold. That is, I'm justified in holding it. And furthermore, I expect you to recognize those claims. And interestingly, when we agree, the recognition of those two normative statuses happens implicitly and by default. But when we disagree, then those two normative statuses that I expect you to recognize, you are no longer in a position to recognize them. The normative statuses that I claim for myself are incompatible with the ones that you, the very same ones, you think you're correct in holding your different view, and you think you're entitled to hold that different view that you hold. Those normative statuses are not compatible with each other. And so when I seek your recognition of those normative statuses I claim for myself, you can't grant me that recognition. And similarly, that situation is symmetrical. I can't grant you the recognition you think you deserve, that I should grant you, that I owe you, because those normative statuses are incompatible with a pair of normative statuses that I have claimed for myself. So disagreement is a tension between us and not just between what we think or hold or believe. And that tension can kind of add to the stakes of the situation. Now let me talk for a moment about trust. Turning to the sociologists, we have an oft-cited definition of interpersonal trust. Rousseau et al. Define it as a psychological state comprising the intention on the part of the trustee to accept a vulnerability based on based upon positive expectations of the intentions or behavior of another. So I'm going to unpack that for a minute, and as I start to unpack it, I'm going to bring it into the philosophical literature, because there's some important features of that notion of trust that are going to weigh heavily into the argument that I'm going to make. They're going to matter. So the sociologist Suzanne McMurphy at the University of Windsor talks about some constitutive elements of trust from the trustor's perspective. First, she mentions the willingness to take a risk or to be vulnerable in the face, second, of some uncertainty or some uncertain outcome. And finally, 3, we do that regarding the positive expectations of another. I want to say a little bit about each of those points. So the first one, I parse them just slightly differently, as you'll see in a second, but there's a reason. So the first one is that there's a vulnerability, so there's a bunch of stuff coming up in the chat, and I can't tell whether I'm supposed to pay attention to that. So maybe, Michael, you'll jump in if I do, because when that happens, it pops up on my screen, and I don't know what I'm supposed to do. So the first one is that there's a vulnerability or a risk undertaken. That is, there's something at stake for me, and the outcome isn't certain. So I can be left worse off if things go badly. Secondly, there's an element of dependence or reliance. I'm dependent on you for realizing this end or tending to this good, namely the thing that's at stake for me. And I do so without any guarantee of success. So I can't do this on my own. I'm dependent or reliant upon you. And if you don't come through, things can be worse off for me. And finally, we're going to spend a bit of time talking about this. There is what I will call a Straussonian, I'll explain that momentarily, a Straussonian expectation. I expect that you will act rightly. This expectation isn't merely a predictive one, it's a normative one. That it's normative speaks to its sort of Straussonian nature. So I expect that you will act rightly. I expect not merely that something will be the case, but I expect something of you. That's part of the normativity of this expectation, as being more than predictive. I expect of you that you will be rightly motivated by my interests and by the fact that they are mine. I want to talk a little bit more about the nature of this positive expectation in 3. And in doing this, I'm going to kind of bombard you a little bit with a sampling of some philosophical writings to sort of tease out the nature of this expectation and the normative contours of it, because they factor heavily in the nature of trust as distinct from reliance, and indeed is into distrust. So a very early writer in the philosophy of trust, Annette Beyer, writes, when I trust another, I depend on their goodwill toward me. Much more recently, in their introduction to a compilation on the philosophy of trust, Paul Faulkner and Thomas Simpson write, Trust, involves the expectation that the trusted will see a trusting's party's dependence as a reason to do what the trusting party expects. So one of the important parts about this positive expectation is that it has a motivational component. My expectation, as we'll see the next two philosophers talk about quite explicitly, the expectation is that you will be motivated by the fact that I am vulnerable and relying on you. So Victoria McGeer and Philip Petit say, I display an attitude of trust just insofar as I assume that the manifest fact that I am relying on you will weigh with you as a reason for you to prove reliable. And similarly, Karen Jones writes, someone who is trustworthy takes the fact that they are being counted on to be a reason, perhaps a compelling reason, for acting as counted on. It's this motivational feature of trust that gives it a layer of normativity that distinguishes it from mere reliance. So I'm going to talk a little bit more from two philosophers about how they make that distinction. First, we will look at Annette Byer's early work. Again, this is the same one that I quoted earlier. You'll see from the last line. Annette Byer writes that the difference between trusting and relying upon is that reliance, I'm going to paraphrase this, has a motivational component, right? We rely on the goodwill of another towards one. The key point here then being, so reliance can happen in the absence of that motivational component. Quote, the trusting can be betrayed or at least let down and not just disappointed. The important part about this normative feature of trust that I've been mentioning and the motivational element is that it warrants a Straussonian attitude of betrayal when trust is disappointed. So here's a person who actually thinks, Richard Holton, that this Straussonian language is this participant stance. Roughly, Peter Holton thinks that this entitlement to feel gratitude when one's trust is met or satisfied, and similarly to feel betrayed and not merely disappointed when one's trust is violated or disappointed. This is the defining feature of trust. It's the thing that separates trust from reliance. So Richard Holton writes, the difference between trust and reliance is that trust involves something like what we've been talking about, a participant stance, that is the taking of what Peter Strawson called participant reactive attitudes. Essentially what that is a way of looking at another in such a way that we can feel those moral emotions like gratitude or resentment according as to how they act. When you trust someone to do something, you rely on them to do it, and you regard that reliance in a certain way. You have a readiness to feel betrayal, should it be disappointed, and gratitude, should it be upheld. In short, you take the stance of trust towards the person on whom you rely. So like Strawson did, Holton is locating it in the attitude and reading the trust out of the attitude. The important part here is the last sentence for us anyway. When a car breaks down, we might be angry. When a friend lets us down, we feel betrayed. The difference again is in the moral attitudes that are putatively sanctioned, putatively applicable in situations of trust that are not merely in situations of reliance. So this is crucial because when I feel betrayed, when I feel resentment, those moral attitudes weigh heavily back into situations of our disagreement. So let me just say a couple more quick things about trust. First of all, trust and distrust are contraries rather than contradictories. So there's a space in between them, which is neither trust nor distrust. Trust and distrust can be reasonably or unreasonably held as attitudes. They should be held when we have good reasons to take those attitudes. And here, if you want a patented bit of philosophy for you, here's a philosophical answer to when we should trust. We should trust just when the other is trustworthy, and we should distrust just when the other deserves our distrust, when they're distrustworthy. One of the important things about trust that we're going to be talking about, it's going to come back in a moment, is that unlike, say, belief, trust and distrust are not wholly responsive to the evidence. I can trust despite the evidence. In fact, some see that as a kind of an important and constitutive feature of trust, right? Trust is a kind of a lens through which I read the evidence. And that lens affects my responsiveness to it. So if my friend tells me they've been accused of a crime and there's this mound of evidence, in front of us, and they say, look, you just have to trust me. All this is contrived evidence. I really didn't do it. Well, I might actually have to believe according to the evidence. I can trust despite the evidence. And importantly, so too can I distrust despite the evidence. Part of the reason for that, as I mentioned, is that trust and distrust supply these interpretive frameworks for the evidence. That is, they affect how we count or weigh the evidence that we have or get. So I couldn't find a good picture of Karen Jones. Karen Jones talks about trust as an affective attitude. And she writes this: trust restricts the interpretations we will consider as possibly applying to the words and actions of another. Trusting thus functions analogously to blinkered vision. It shields a whole range of interpretations about the motives of another and restricts the inferences we will make about the likely actions of another. Trusting thus opens one up to harm. So trusting itself is undertaking this risk or vulnerability again, for it gives rise to selective interpretation, which means that one can be fooled. So this idea that trust is an interpretive framework, it gives us this blinkered vision, which selects a range of interpretation of the evidence over another range which it selects against or it deselects, is crucial, because distrust does the exact same thing, right? Just as I can trust despite the evidence, I can distrust despite the evidence, which is why at least some theorists on trust feel that trust building exercises, activities to gain trust, are not possible until distrust itself has been removed, and that these are separate acts. It's not like I'm going to build trust, and in building trust, I'm going to sort of relieve you. I'm going to get, solve the problem of distrust. Some theorists take these to be quite different moments. There's, that's debated. But the point is that insofar as there is distrust, the kinds of things that I might do to try to show you that I'm trustworthy are going to be viewed through the lens, and perhaps quite justifiably, of your distrust. And that means that the kinds of things that I might have to do to get to a position in between trust and distrust are sort of quite different than the things I might be able to do once you're there to earn your trust. Distrust then, as trust, has a positive reinforcing cycle. Distrust has a negative one. And that's something we should kind of worry about. One other thing about trust, Annette Beyer told us that the best reason that we can have for our confidence in another's good care of what we care about is that that object of our care, that object of value, the object that is, that I'm vulnerable about, the good care of, if that's a common good, then I can be more confident that you will act appropriately according to it. And in fact, that whole notion is a notion that informs several theories of trust. Russell Hardin's in particular encapsulated interest theory of trust tries to look at or frame the goods that are at stake in relationships of trust as in somehow common or encapsulated within the self-interest of the trustor, of the trustee rather, in such a way that the trustee needn't be motivated purely by benevolent motivations, but instead can actually be motivated by their self-interest in a certain way and nevertheless still behave in trustworthy kinds of ways. So as a consequence, though, when our interests are, when the interests and vulnerabilities are mutual, then the risks of dependence and reliance are minimized. It's easier for me to, there's less risk. It's easier for me to count on your goodwill. On the other hand, when where the interests and vulnerabilities don't coincide, the risks inherent in trust relationships are amplified. So our disagreement indicates a lack of alignment, even an incompatibility between those interests and vulnerabilities. As I've already mentioned, first of all, I'm seeking your recognition for two normative statuses, which I claim for myself, which you're not in a position to recognize, since you claim incompatible normative statuses for yourself when we disagree. So in that sense, our interests and vulnerabilities put us in some sense at odds with each other. And that means that in some sense, the risks in trusting relationships are higher because we can't be sure that the goods are shared, the goods that are at stake. So disagreement can actually place additional demands on trust. In section 3, I'm going to say a few quick words about arguing as a social activity. And this is really short because we're very quickly going to move to the question of viewing argumentation as an exercise in trust. So arguing is, as I conceive it, just a way that we have of reasoning together. For our purposes, we can think of it as an activity that we jointly undertake to manage and hopefully resolve our disagreements through transacting reasons. A couple of things that I want to point out about this social activity of arguing. The first one is it's costly. It has opportunity costs. We don't tend to do it if we don't have to. We don't argue about things that don't matter to us. We don't argue if we don't need the agreement of the other. So arguing is something that we only do kind of as a last resort, if you will. Of course, there are other resorts that don't involve transacting reasons that we can resort to after that. But it's not the first thing that we do. If we don't have to, we tend not to. And in that sense, it's actually like reasoning itself, but solo reasoning. But that's another matter for a different day. The other one is this, and we'll revisit this. So we'll get back to this point. Arguing has risks. We can be worse off after exchanging our reasons than we were when we just disagreed. I'm going to talk about different ways that can be, but a colleague who I don't have a citation for in the presentation, Jean Goodwin, a communication theorist, as a result of a sort of a survey research she was citing, said that one of the most common reactions to arguments by arguers after the argumentation is done is that it makes them angry. And so now they're worse off. I mean, when they started, they disagreed and they perhaps couldn't get where they needed to go by way of that agreement, what they needed the agreement for, but at least they weren't put off. After the argumentation, they can be both of those things and put off with the other person. So arguing has risks. That is, it can, if it doesn't go well, it can actually damage further the relationship between disagreeers. And we'll look at other ways that that can happen in a minute. What I really want to do, though, when talking about arguing, is I want to look at it as an act of trust. As I said, part of this paper is to try to sort of give you a sense of how it is that one might reasonably see persistence in disagreement following the transaction of reasons as evidence of distrust. And so I'm going to try to build that up. And here's the first way. I'm going to try to show you how you could reasonably view arguing as an act of trust. So let's look at trust and the pragmatics of arguing. First of all, by arguing with you, so when I argue with you, I exhibit, I contend, you can reasonably see what you're doing as exhibiting the three characteristics of trust we looked at before. First, I exhibit my vulnerability. There's something at stake for me which is valuable enough to me that arguing with you over it is worth my while. And I risk the further vulnerability of things being worse off for me or between us if our differences go unresolved. So I'm undertaking this risk. There is a vulnerability. There's something at stake for me. Secondly, I exhibit my dependence upon you. Not only is there something at stake for me which makes it worth my while to argue with you, but it's something that I can't realize on my own. That is, even if the only thing at stake here is your agreement or your recognition or your approval or your sharing the same beliefs that I do, none of those things are things that I can grant on my own by myself. Only you can do that. So I'm dependent upon you. And of course, if the things that are at stake are also of value to me, that is, if the matters at hand are ones for which practical downstream consequences are things that I can only realize if you agree with me, like you have to move your fence 3 feet to the left because that's where the property line is and I want to build my deck, right? That's also something that's at stake for me. And it's something that I can't realize on my own. So I'm dependent upon you for, if you will, the extra argumentative goods that are at stake in whatever disagreement holds between us. And I don't mean to downplay those. Those can be huge. They can really, really matter. And lastly, by arguing with you, I exhibit that I have a Straussonian expectation of you. In arguing with you, I presume your competence as a reasoner, your reason responsiveness, and your goodwill, your not being pig-headed. I'll get back to that, as for those of you who should know, that's a technical philosophy term, and I'll talk to you a little bit about what that means in just a sec. I depend on those things in giving you my reasons, and I expect you to recognize the merits of those reasons. So now let's look to the theorist, Catherine Schulz. If you don't know Schulz's work, I highly recommend it to you. There's I'll see if I can just read it into the video at the end of the talk. I have a brief reference cited section I'll just leave up, and you can, if you're looking at it again, screenshot it. Catherine Schulz studies something that she calls wrongology. And it's her research is top-notch and quite funny. One of the things that she talks about in a TED Talk on being wrong is how is it that we can explain our disagreements? So suppose we discover that we disagree, and I don't change my mind when I discover our disagreement, right? I say, oh yeah, well, I don't defer to you. I notice that we disagree and I hold my original viewpoint. How can I explain that difference of opinion? Here, Schulz suggests are three proximate explanations. The first one is, and I'm using, she uses more provocative language than I do. The first one is you're uninformed or you're ignorant. That's a philosopher's sense of ignorant. It just means an absence of knowledge. The second one is that you're reasoning badly or you're incompetent. So you have all the information you need, you just don't know what to do with it. And the last one is you're being malicious or pig-headed. One of the things that we might do when we think about arguing is that we might think of it as diagnostic of our disagreements. That is, when we exchange reasons with one another, our aim is to figure out what's gone wrong in our disagreement and to select from among those interpretations which one is the most plausible. Now, of course, one of the things that can happen is that when we exchange our reasons, I can discover about myself that I was uninformed or reasoning badly. I might even come to discover that I was malicious. But the interesting thing is when you ask anyone prior to our acts of reason giving, are you mistaken? You know, are you reasoning fallaciously, or are you being pig-headed? No one actually answers yes to that, surprisingly. When we disagree with them, at least is surprising. So, of course, when we exchange our reasons, I can come to change my opinion about that. I can come to discover that I was misinformed or uninformed, or that I had reasoned badly. And that means I can come to change my view, or at least my reasons for my view. But what I want to consider are the cases when that doesn't happen. I want to consider the situation where, when we've exchanged our reasons, things haven't worked out. We still disagree. I haven't changed my view and you haven't changed yours, at least not to the extent that we agree. And I want you to consider now in that situation, what's gone wrong? And I'm going to tell you kind of what's gone wrong, if you will, from my point of view. But what I want you to appreciate is that this is symmetrical. Each disagreeer, having not changed their view, will see the situation in the way I contend, in the way that I propose. So the first is, I'm still not wrong. Your reasons haven't prompted me to change my view. So I'm still not mistaken in my belief from my point of view. Secondly, I'm not the one being unreasonable. There's nothing wrong from my point of view with my reasons, except that they've failed to persuade you. So I'm not being pig-headed or incompetent. Instead, the problem is something with you. And now we're back to Catherine Schulz's order of explanation here. The question facing me is, are you ignorant or incompetent or pig-headed? But here's the problem. As we have transacted our reasons together, we work down that order of explanation, writing off some of them until we get to the bottom one. So it's not just that you're ignorant or uninformed anymore, because I've given you all the information, the evidence or reasons that I think you should need to come to agree with me and to share my view. So the explanation of our disagreement isn't anymore that you're uninformed, because I've given you all the information I think you should need. And secondly, it's not that you're incompetent. I'm going to put a pin on that and we'll get back to it. But one of the things that I want you to notice is that in arguing with another person, in offering them your reasons, this presupposes that they're competent to transact those reasons. If you didn't think that the person was a competent reasoner, you wouldn't transact reasons with them. You'd try to resolve your disagreements with them in some other way. And indeed, when I offer you my reasons, if I have any dialectical, rhetorical sensibility about myself, I try to offer you exactly those bits of information that I think explain the gap between our differences of opinion. I try to put in front of you exactly those reasons that I think should actually make you come around, that you will recognize the significance of. So my arguing with you has already implicitly presupposed that it's not a failure of competence on your part. Which means, and now we're getting to the sort of the heart of this argument, the answer seems to be that you're being pig-headed. So As I told you, pig-headed is a technical philosophy term, so maybe we should look at what it means. Robert Fogelin wrote, the philosopher Robert Fogelin, to call someone pig-headed is to make quite a specific charge. They continue to cling to a position despite the fact that compelling reasons have been brought against it. So roughly, being pig-headed is a kind of an insincerity, an argumentative or a doxastic, a belief-oriented insincerity. You're willfully not rightly responsive to my reasons. That's what it is to be pig-headed. When you don't come to agree with me, after I tailor a set of manifestly to me compelling reasons to your understanding, seemingly the most proximate and plausible explanation of our continued disagreement for me is your stubborn recalcitrance. And now all of a sudden, it seems to me like you might be able to be disappointing this kind of Straussonian expectation, right? After all, my dependence upon you, my vulnerability to you, all of those things are manifest. Just by the fact that I'm offering you reasons, it makes manifest the very things that I think should motivate you. And now when I offer those reasons and you don't come around, the kind of the innocent explanations get swept off the table. And what's left actually is an explanation about why we don't agree that has your motivations to heart. It says, no, you're not actually being rightly motivated, even though you can see how much this matters to me. One of the persons who said something similar to this is another philosopher, Fabio Pagliari. And I'm almost done, so I promise. I've made the argument for the opposing case. The argument for my case takes very little time. So just another couple of minutes, honestly, is all we need here. Fabio writes, your having different opinions from me is understandable and legitimate, but your refusing to accept what I consider valid reasons is easily taken to indicate a stubbornness and a lack of cooperative disposition. Moreover, you've witnessed my labors to rationally persuade you. So the fact that you don't yield to my view may seem to me to indicate that you care more for your own opinion than you do for my sake. And I just want to sort of highlight that last part, because when we get away from that arguments that don't succeed feeling, as Gene Goodwin described it to us, reported to us, that anger can actually be a moral anger, right? The moral anger is, you obviously see how important this is for me. You obviously see how much this matters. You obviously see all the trouble I've gone to try to show you that I'm right. And yet, here you are, you're still disagreeing with me. And because of that, I'm deprived of those extra argumentative goods that are really at stake for me. And I, again, do not at all want to understate what those stakes can be. Now I have this moral resentment. And remember, according to Holton, it's that willingness to feel resentment upon our expectations being disappointed that is characteristic of trust and similarly of distrust. So here we're at the end. I have a couple quick slides to finish this off. What I've tried to do so far is to make what I can take to be the strongest possible case one might have for thinking that resentment is a justified reaction to persistence in disagreement. And based on that resentment, that distrust is a reasonable attitude to take after persuasion failure. My argument is that persuasion failure is not a reason to distrust. And roughly, the argument is very quick, and it goes like this. If the good that I take to be at stake in arguing is getting you to believe what I do, to agree with me, then what I am putatively trusting you with, the object of my trust, is the wrong kind of thing. It's not something that can properly be an object of trust. And here's why. The good that we seek to entrust to the discretionary care of others are only those things for which our entrusting them to the other is something that can properly motivate the other to take proper care of. But my entrusting to you, let me put it this way. My entrusting to you that you should believe a certain kind of thing or agree with me in a certain kind of way, those are not things for which that I have so entrusted you with them can motivate you to do as I expect. So in cases of disagreement, the recognition that I'm right cannot be the good that I trust such parties or the actions that I count on them to do. Here's why. My vulnerability to the truth or falsity of my view, you're believing it or not, what I take to be true, or you're agreeing with me. And similarly, my dependence upon you for those things, as well as whatever other extra argumentative goods that might be at stake, none of those things are reasons for or against the truth of my view. Those indeed are wholly irrelevant to whether or not my view is true. And as such, those things that are part of the motivational structure of a trusting relationship, those things that are supposed to motivate the trustor to the trustee to act as the trustor expects them to, they cannot properly be motivations when the good that is putatively at stake is a belief. You can't believe for my sake, and thus I cannot trust you to believe or to agree. There are many things that I can trust you for, but that's not among them. And hence, when we disagree, that's not a reason that I should distrust you. I'm going to say one other thing. This is the closing slide. Michael Williams talks about a strict epistemic liability that believers have. So when we disagree, we can justifiably downgrade another's epistemic authority. And we can do that even if we do not deem the other to have been epistemically irresponsible or blameworthy. Rather, when we disagree with one another, we may rightly no longer rely on their judgment in the relevant domain of belief. We might never count on their opinions. And that's fine. To conclude that we can't rely on a person with whom we disagree, that's quite right. But what I want to take out of that is I want to put it back into the domain of reliance, where the moral motivations, the moral sentiments of resentment are taken away. Because if we allow our disagreements to open up cycles of distrust for bad reasons, like if we do it for good reasons, fair enough, but for mistaken reasons, then we will start ourselves down a path where getting back to not only agreement, but to trust is increasingly irrecoverable. So I promised you, and you can pause on them if you're watching this later, a few of the references that I mentioned in this talk. And that's it. I've left a few minutes. I've left a few minutes for questions. Thank
Excellent.
you.
Thank you so much, David. That's really fascinating. Thank you. And we do have a few questions that have been dropped into the chat. And I'm going to go ahead and I think would certainly have more than we have time to kind of address, but we can also have the recording go a little bit longer. So the session go a little bit longer if you're able to stay. We end in 3 minutes, but I think we might try to get through the questions that we have here, and you're welcome to stay if you can. All right, from Jeffrey Davis. Excited about all this. Thank you. Question: is the symmetry between the constitutive elements of trust and what is entailed in the pragmatics of arguing unique to argument, or is it something that comes with language use? If it is the case that the symmetry is incurred by language use, Might there be another element to the symmetry that is unique to argumentation, right? Such as the selection for or against certain sets of epistemic or hermeneutic resources?
So the question comes on a little bit fast. So if I can try to say this, are the elements of symmetry generally communicative? I think that there
Right.
are normative dimensions of communicative activity that are symmetrical. I haven't thought about how those are ones that are generally the ones that might pertain to communication generally factor in here. What I've tried to do, I think, is isolate some that are particular to argumentation and the transaction of reasons. So maybe, Jeffrey, the best answer I can give you is thank you very much for your question. I probably have to think about that a little bit more. But if we can think of any factors that are particularly relevant to this sort of cluster of problems, I'd love to hear more about them. Sorry, you deserve a better answer.
Okay. Klaus Kostenbauer asks the following. How about this? When you and I disagree, I can sense if you are genuinely interested in what my view is while suspending judgment at the moment. I will reward your willingness to hear me out in a calm and unrushed way with a likewise attitude. The result is trust.
So first of all, Klaus, it's delightful that you made it. I can't actually believe that you're here. It's lovely. Thank you. One of the things that I think is we can get is if a person shows signs of being closed-minded, right? So this is part of the worry, is that when we transact our reasons and we don't change our view, we can readily interpret that as the other being closed-minded to our reasons. And so one of the things I take it, Klaus, that you're offering is that we can try to exhibit a genuine open-mindedness and a willingness to hear the other reasoner, hear the other reasons, and a willingness to change one's mind. Yes, I think that is one of the ways that we can signal to another arguer that we're not being pig-headed. The problem, of course, is as we go through those reasons, and I do the work of giving reasons in doing that, we still go down the same hierarchy of explanations. And by the time we come to the bottom, maybe you're having not changed your mind, despite all the work that I've done to try to show you that mine is actually the right view, trumps your claim to be willing to patiently hear out my reasons. And it actually shows me that, no, you probably not. You say you're open-minded, but not really. And I think we can imagine situations where it actually goes like that. So thank you, by the way, Klaus. It's very lovely to think that you're here. It really is.
Okay. Thank you, David. David Matheson writes, do you think there's any plausibility to the thought that we don't argue with others? We only assert or testify to them when we think they trust us, such that argumentation presupposes a certain baseline level of distrust, in addition to whatever trust it presupposes?
So, David, thank you. I think this is a lovely question. And yes, when people don't just take things on the basis of our say-so. So I have actually another paper that kind of talks about this. It actually talks about reassurance views of testimony and how those only work well in certain kinds of situations. So I had talked about this default mechanism of recognition in cases of agreement. And when you move into cases of disagreement, that recognitional structure changes. So it moves us off of the default model. And I think something similar is going on when we have to undertake the path of reasons giving to change one another's minds, rather than you're just accepting on the basis of my say-so. And importantly, one of the ways that you could do that, incidentally, is an act of epistemic deference, right? We could have a difference of opinion, but upon hearing my say-so, you could defer, or I could defer to you is more likely the case. And that would resolve our disagreement, and it wouldn't get into the process of reason giving. That act of deference might be an act of trust, or it might be an act of recognition of a kind of epistemic authority. It could go either way. But yes, when that isn't happening, we already have, well, that deference isn't there. And that's a sign that maybe I'm confident enough in my views that I do just think you're mistaken this time. I don't know whether that's a sign of distrust already, but it's certainly a sign that the deference isn't happening.
Thank you, David. Once again, thanks to everyone for joining us today. We are officially over, but we're kind of in overtime now, and I just want to make sure to get these questions read so that David has a chance to react to them. You're welcome to stay with us as long as we work our way through the questions. Bethany Larson has the following question. If getting someone to agree with me is not a proper goal I'm counting on someone to do, could I trust them to try to understand me? And how would you describe the difference between belief and understanding in this context?
So I think, and that's a really neat question. I haven't thought about it because, of course, understanding precedes agreement. I can't judge the truth of something I don't know what it means or what it's saying. I think the problem is in a way similar there. You might say that a person could be obstinate in giving uncharitable or confabulated kind of readings or understandings of what I'm trying to say or what someone else is trying to say, and that might prompt you to be distrustful of them, as viewing them as being particularly uncharitable in their approaches to understanding one another, into meaning making, sense making. Similarly, though, I do think that the problem is similar in that while I don't deny that people can disagree for reasons that are good evidence of their distrustworthiness. And I don't want to deny that then people can willfully misunderstand in ways that show that we shouldn't trust them. What I do want to say is the evidence for each of those things goes beyond merely a misunderstanding or a disagreement. There has to be something more that we need. And what we like to do, especially after we've had all this talk with each other, is rely on the evidence of misunderstanding or disagreement to be accusatory in pointing a moral finger to justify our Straussonian reactive attitude. And I think that's a dangerous mistake, a harmful one to all of us.
Thank you, David. Scott Aiken has this question. Is one consequence that we should take the objective stance with each other when it comes to belief change?
No, insofar as it's a very thoughtful question, Scott. No, what we have to do, I think, is understand the ways in which belief changes, those things upon which belief change properly depends. As I said, I do think that we can rightly find that people are willfully obstinate in holding the beliefs that they do. I just don't think that the reason that we can make such a judgment properly is simply that they disagree with us. What more we need, because I've said, when we reason with them, it starts to point us in the direction of their willful obstinance. I'm not yet prepared to say, I'm not sure. But if we simply treat them as truth detectors, then we are missing out something very important about everything else that's going on in the exchange. One of the things, though, that we should recognize is, at least if you're like me, if they're proper believers and they know their beliefs and they're sincere, the things that beliefs are properly responsive to is evidence. It's not these other kinds of things. So good question, very tricky.
We have 3 more questions.
Thank you so much, Michael, particularly for holding on, all of you. Thank you.
Yeah, and by the way, I will record the chat and I'll copy all this stuff and put it in a document for you, David, so you have these questions to think about later. From Wei Zhang, what would be the approach we can use to improve reasoning and trust despite our differences? What would you recommend?
So this is neat. Jeffrey Davis was here before, and he and I just wrote a paper, and I was delighted to be able to work with him on listening as a communicative virtue and as a way of, first of all, as a way of adversarially listening to increase the adversarial nature of our communicative exchanges. And then secondly, ways that we can actually listen better so as to decrease the adversariality of those relationships. In general, my inclination is to look to a bunch of intellectual and communicative virtues and suggest, as one questioner, and I now forget which one, so please my apologies, suggested, that is, we do ways of openly signaling our, I'm going to use the word trustworthiness, that is, our intellectual virtues of being open-minded, of being willing to listen. Those are the kinds of things that I think that we need to do. And of course, sometimes our behavior belies those words. So our actions, I think, speak louder than words. We can't just say that we're genuinely open-minded. Many of us do that. Here's one thing that I ask my students to do. I don't just get them to say, are you willing to change your mind? I get them to specify under what circumstances they would get themselves to change their mind, what circumstances they would count. And then I ask them to look at the evidence that they have for the view that they do. And I try to get them to close the gap between those. Because quite often we ask for the world to change our mind. And when we give our reasons, they're paltry by comparison. So I think that some sort of judicious self-reflection helps. And the practice of some of those intellectual virtues and communicative virtues, at least that's what I try to do when I'm teaching some of this stuff, is to instill that to my students. So thank you. I think it's a very good question, because we do have to try, as Scott and Rob have pointed out, to restore civility to our discourse. And that is, I think, a good way of doing so. Thank you as well.
Yeah, and I put a link to the Phil Papers page for the publication that you and Jeffrey generated, just so if anybody's interested in, I think the DOI is located there, so you can kind of move from that page to where you might find the article. Christian Lotz had several questions. I'm just going to read one. He had to leave, so I don't think he'll be too annoyed with me. Question one. You began your talk by referring to distrust in public discussions. However, you then focused on interpersonal relations alone. I wonder whether this is a proper way to talk about social. For example, what if claims and arguments are put out by companies, governmental institutions, PR agencies, the Communist Party, people who belong to certain classes, cultures, traditions, or ages? Does that matter to your idea of a competent reasoner? And isn't this important for the problems of trust? So, questioning whether the individual case is a appropriate model for the social case.
So I actually scale it out in the opposite direction to the one that Christian started with. There's a part of this research that I didn't have a chance to talk about today. And roughly it starts with looking at something that Edna Ullman-Margalit calls trust replacers. So when you and I can't settle our disagreements between ourselves, we turn to certain kinds of social institutions, which Edna Ullman-Margalit calls trust replacers, to resolve those. So you and I have a fight about the property line. Neither of us will concede. We take it to court. I know now that I can't count on you to be reasonable, but hopefully I can count on the court to be reasonable, and the court is just going to compel you, right? So that is actually I kind of turn that question around. I think that it starts from a set of human practices that are meted out between individuals and gets scaled into institutions. Now, there's a feedback loop there, so that when you arguing with people on Facebook or Twitter, they repeat talking points Those talking points are the points that identify them with some of the groups or institutions that Christian might have mentioned, for instance. To me, that just complicates the situation of arguing with that individual. So that's the lens through which I try to approach the question, Christian, that you asked. Thank you, Dima. I see I'm very humbled and grateful, Dima, that you were able to make it. Thank you so much.
One last question, and this is from Jason Patrick Mask. How do we get, and I think this is an important question, how do we get people to want to engage in any of these normative issues? I mean, it has some similarity, I think, to Wei's question as well. But
So, yeah, this is a question of, how do we, to me, it's a question of how do we get people to care? And I'm sorry, I wish I had a good answer for that. I mean, to me, you could even show how much hangs in the balance. So I do think that we can distrust when people don't participate in kind of some of the open ways that we were talking about, or even at all, in these kinds of particularly rational resolution and disagreement management exercises, practices that we have. Those, I think, are reasons to distrust, because the people who can afford not to engage in those are the people who have the power in the situation. They have the best exit options. They can live with our disagreement, and it doesn't matter to them that we continue to disagree. And so I do think that you can find reason to distrust when the person is not open to or willing to undertake in those disagreement management and disagreement resolution procedures, because that shows an absence of care of exactly the right sort to suggest that they are untrustworthy. So I think it's a really good question. But as to the general question of how do we get people to care, I wish I knew, because I don't.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for staying with us. Really appreciate
Michael,
this. And David, thank you for your time and all of your thoughtful, all of your thoughts about this very important topic. Again, the UIC is a regular event that will get going once more in September of 2021, so just in a few months. Please keep us in mind. If you have an hour to kill around lunchtime on Fridays, we'd love to have you back.
Thank you, everyone. Michael, especially, well, to everyone for your time and going the extra mile for me. I really appreciate it. The comments were awesome. So I will be parsing them out in the aftermath. Michael,
Awesome.
Thank you so much.
You bet. My pleasure.